Intelligence agencies have infiltrated and created some satanic groups, with the resurgence of these groups beginning in 1966, particularly with the birth of the Church of Satan, founded by Anton LaVey. LaVey studied criminology in San Francisco and worked in the San Francisco Police Department Crime Lab. He also worked as an informant for Interpol. Prior to the Church of Satan, LaVey ran a group called the Magic Circle. LaVey's most famous associate is the National Security Agency General Michael Aquino. At the time of his membership in LaVey's group, Aquino was an Army specialist in intelligence and psychological warfare. In 1973, he became the executive officer of the 306th Psychological Operations Battalion, contemporary with his founding of the Church of Set. General Michael Aquino wrote, "From PSYOP to Mind War, the Psychology of Victory." Aquino's thesis stated that enemy populations could be subdued by inflicting a state of psychological terror and feelings of imminent destruction. He discusses the use of psychotronic weapons or electromagnetic weapons that influence the mind. Capitulation could be induced without firing a shot by extremely low-frequency signals piggybacked on broadcasts of radio, TV, or microwave communications in order to influence and manipulate the thoughts and feelings of the target population. During the 1960s, he was prominent in the Church of Satan and a close friend of Anton LaVey until he started his own Church of Set. A police intelligence report dated July 1, 1981 reads, quote, "The Church of Set is a group of hundreds of members that operates on a national level. Michael Aquino is the official head and rules through a council of 9 who are in fact his lieutenants." Unquote. At least 2 members of the Council of 9 at that time were members of Army intelligence. In the late 1980s, Aquino was accused by the San Francisco Police Department of being involved in a satanic child molestation ring centered on the daycare at the Presidio military base where Aquino was stationed at the time. Probable victims numbered at 68, many of whom had contracted venereal disease. 22 families filed $66 million in claims against the Army, claiming that criminal charges against Michael Aquino were dropped due to pressure from the Army. General Aquino admitted to renting the German castle where the Nazi SS were formed and reenacting the secret ceremony among fellow intelligence officers dressed in full Nazi regalia. General Aquino is now the highest-ranking officer in the National Security Agency, along with General Black and General Hayden. It is important to remember that General Aquino is first and foremost a military intelligence officer with over 40 years' experience in counterinsurgency operations and an expert in psychological warfare. General Aquino's psychological warfare campaign has started or infiltrated cults and other closed systems as part of a concerted effort to control large numbers of people and to destabilize the centers of constitutional and legal authority both here in the United States and in other nations. This methodology is part of a concerted plan that spans several generations. The Church of Satan and the Church of Set, as well as other cults and mainstream organizations, are closed systems with their own belief systems that are insular and separate from the reality that most people take for granted. These closed systems allow large numbers of people to be manipulated into performing antisocial acts that most members of the greater society would not contemplate. Aquino first participated in MKUltra-related activities in Vietnam as part of the Phoenix program in the 1960s. These ongoing MKUltra operations are functioning as a counterinsurgency and infiltration operation aimed at destabilizing the United States and other industrialized nations. The following cults have been used by General Aquino or his associates to continue MKUltra operations outside of the laboratory. The mass suicides at Jonestown of 890 people had similar threads, a cult with sinister connections. Jim Jones, who had connections to the CIA, set up his utopian experiment on the same land the CIA had used to train mercenaries to fight in Angola. According to investigators, the Jonestown experiment was conceived of by Dr. Lawrence Laird Layton, staffed by him and financed by Layton. The African-American cult had at its core a Caucasian inner council composed of Layton and his family. Layton was a chemist in the Manhattan Project and head of the Army's Chemical Warfare Research Division in the 1950s. The People's Temple cult took over the Mendocino State Hospital as a part of a government pilot project to evaluate the feasibility of deinstitutionalizing mental patients. After a reduction in state funding, most of the patients at the Mendocino State Psychiatric Hospital were released into the custody of the People's Temple. Congressman Leo Ryan was assassinated in his attempt to investigate the cult. The pathologist in Guyana reported 80 to 90% of the victims' bodies had fresh needle marks. Other victims had been shot or strangled. In 1981, the survivors sued the former head of the CIA for, quote, enhancing the economic and political powers of James Warren Jones, unquote, and of conducting mind control and drug experimentation on the Temple flock. The Manson family was associated with the Process Church, which according to the Utah Department of Public Safety moved to southern Utah and changed their name to the Foundation. In a 1990 internal memo authored by church authority Glenn L. Pace, allegations were made of ritual abuse and human sacrifice. Pace writes that he has met with 60 victims of ritual abuse, but there were probably 2 to 3 times as many victims. 53 were female and 7 were male, 8 of which were children. All are members of the Mormon Church. 45 victims alleged they witnessed or participated in human sacrifice. The majority were abused by relatives. All had developed psychological problems such as multiple personality disorder. Quote, the memories come in layers. The first might be of incest. Another layer might well be the memory of seeing people hurt or even killed. Then they remember having seen babies killed. Another layer is realizing that they participated in the sacrifices. One of the most painful memories may be that they even sacrificed their own baby. I have only seen those coming forth to get help. They are in their 20s and 30s for the most part. I can only assume that it is expanding geometrically, and am horrified by the numbers represented by the generation who are now children and teenagers." Unquote. Dr. Joseph Mengele found that trauma bonding and mind control work best when the victim is forced to kill someone they love, usually a twin. The Franklin conspiracy refers to a sexual blackmail operation and savings and loan fraud that began in Omaha, Nebraska in the early 1980s. Larry King, a 300-pound pedophile, operated a national child prostitution network that catered to wealthy patrons and Republican Party insiders. King was one of the fastest rising stars in the Republican Party. He sang the national anthem at the Republican Convention in 1984 and 1988. King and his associates defrauded Franklin Savings and Loan of $40 million and used the residents of Boys Town and other children to videotape powerful and influential men and women engaged in sex acts with minors. These blackmail operations took place during fundraising parties for the Republican Party. Those involved stayed late for the after party that included drugs and sex with minors. The strategy of early MKUltra was to use sexual blackmail operations that targeted political figures in order to ensure continued funding from legislators. Victims who came forward testified that King and his associates performed satanic rituals and human sacrifices. Many of the children who came forward with their stories have since been murdered or imprisoned. The most prominent and vocal victim has been held in solitary confinement longer than any other person in Nebraska history. Larry King served 2 years for fraud and was promptly employed by his good friend, the editor of an Omaha newspaper.